Ali's an old friend, a dear friend, from Boston College, which is not too far down the road from Boston University, and he's been instrumental in creating the Middle East program at Boston College. He and I are longtime collaborators, going back over 20 years to the Civil Society Project in the early 1990s. So I'm really delighted he can be with us here today. And by the way, a note to the speakers, because we've had to move the video setup, if you are answering a question, if you would come up to the microphone as opposed to simply sitting in the seat. The mics are live. The mics are live, and they'll capture your responses. But if you're making an extended response, it might be useful for the video to come up to the podium. Okay, I'm sorry for that. We've had a very adaptable crew here, but we don't have all the capabilities we had in the other room. So thank you very much, Ali. It's your platform.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's a pleasure for me to moderate this second session on the regional issues facing Iraq today. Before we start, I just want to say a word in praise of the endeavor initiated by my good friend, Professor Norton, to focus on Iraq, the future of Iraq, Iraq+10, and continuing in the coming years. What I wanted to cite as an example of a path that was not followed was Afghanistan. I remember back in 1990, after the Soviets withdrew, a number of us, we were commissioned by AID to go to Afghanistan, and we came back with a plan to continue American involvement in Afghanistan, not on the war path, but reconstruction. And to our amazement, there was absolutely no interest in the US government to continue the involvement of the United States in Afghanistan at that time. We approached members of Congress, senators, and it just disappeared. I'm delighted to see that that path hopefully is not being followed in the case of Iraq. And I think the Institute for Iraqi Studies is a vibrant and good example of how a different path hopefully shall be followed. We are privileged to have two experts on the topic, Professor Charles Dunbar, Ambassador Dunbar, a diplomat and a scholar, as well as my good friend Matteo Legrenzi, who is a professor at the University of Venice. We are going to be a bit tighter with our time. The presentations will be about 15 minutes, and it's our hope that we would be able to finish by 1 o'clock to allow time for you to have a more leisurely lunch. So we'll start with Professor Legrenzi.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being here. Thanks for bringing me here. I'm very grateful. It's a pleasure to be here and to be introduced by Professor Banuazizi. So I'll try to be brief, and I'll try to sort of frame the issue of Iraqi security in the regional context, in the sort of wider Middle East and Gulf context. And as you will see at the end of the presentation, I actually have more questions than answers, but I obviously help to stimulate a discussion. So what I would like to start with is what we have seen in the last, let's say, 4 or 5 years, is really a sea change in terms of what defines the balance of power, if you will, the balance of threat in the Middle East. Up until, let's say, 3-4 years ago, maybe 5, we could say that the only 2 countries in the Middle East where sectarianism played a significant role where in organizing the politics of the particular country were probably Lebanon and Bahrain. And right now, I think what we are witnessing is the fact that sectarianism is really redefining the whole international relations of the region. And this is not easy for someone who, like a classical realist like me to say, but I think that is actually what is going on. And in addition to that, we have, if we look at the politics of the region, a sort of Islamizing homogenization of the entire regional political context. So that's the first thing I wanted to note, this change in the identity reference of Middle East state power across the region. So what are, from a more sort of policy relevant point of view, some of these identity shapes regional trends? I think that, and this is what I'm looking at more closely, but I think what the main trend is this sort of reinforcement and concurrently defensive behavior by the GCC monarchies. On the one hand, these changes are giving the opportunity to the six Gulf monarchies of the GCC, but in particular Saudi Arabia and Qatar, to project their power in the region, and they're doing it quite aggressively, particularly when compared to their former tradition of very quiet, sort of like a foreign policy making. And at the same time, this sort of activism, in fact, masks a sort of a more long-term insecurity. Because if you had really a spread of something close to democracy or electoral politics, I mean, in the very long term, it would be more and more difficult to justify to their own citizens why someone like in Tunisia can elect his or her president, and you cannot do that in Saudi, let alone in Qatar, but where the body politic is so small that the dynamics are completely different, but that's it. So what we're doing is really this exploiting confessional identity to pursue power across the region. And this is a regional trend. So this leads to a strengthening of the monarchical axis. And we have seen this before in Middle East history, going back to the times of the Arab Cold War and so on and so forth. And history often repeats itself. And then you see, that's why you see these sort of symbolic gestures. For example, the offer of GCC membership to Jordan and Morocco. Any of you who has interacted with the GCC as an organization, let alone spent too much time studying it like me, will know that this is purely symbolic. It's never going to happen. You will never have either Jordan or Morocco as full members of the GCC. I mean, like, let alone Yemen or Iraq or all things. But it's a symbolic move, and it is sort of quite telling, because it is part of this sort of carting around the horses and this actively pursuing external change in order to preserve domestic order. So this is very much sort of a monarchical agenda which the GCC countries, to varying degrees, are pursuing in the region. This is all happening, of course, and we're going to hear more from Ambassador Dunbar on the point, in the context of a shift in American Middle East policy, with the progressive abandonment of direct intervention. And the idea, to me, here seems to be that there will be a cooperative transfer of political responsibility to some key regional strategic partners, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey. Of course, this new order is forged in order to maintain old priorities. Those do not change. But we should not misunderstand this comparative transfer of political responsibility in terms of a lessening of the GCC countries' military dependency on the United States. Because, as we will see, that's one of the few constants in the Gulf security framework, is that the GCC countries will never be autonomous from a military point of view. So we can start from that. I mean, there are very few constants in Middle East politics, let alone in Gulf politics, but this is a fact. And on this, we can then speculate on what is going to happen. And why will GCC countries never be autonomous in terms of their external defense, in spite of all the great resources that they can muster from a financial point of view? Quite simply because it's not worth it for the regimes in these countries to set up effective standing armies, because they have much more to fear from an effective independent standing army as a monarchy than what they could gain in terms of, sort of protecting autonomously from, for example, the Iranian threats from right across the Gulf. So I can go much more in detail technically, but this is it, and this is also the way they conceptualize the entire issue. So I talked to the military quite a bit, the National Defense University or other militaries around the world, and there are always these sort of puzzle questions by some of the military officers. I mean, why do certain things happen that make very little sense from a purely military point of view? And I tell them, look, it's a matter of political expediency. I mean, the separation between the Ars Wataniya and the regular army is not that is done because people do not know that this is going to hamper the military efficiency. It is done because you do not want sort of a centralized sort of army with a clear hierarchy that could come and topple you. And this makes perfect sense. So sometimes there are some Gulf diplomats who get very worked up when you tell them these things, and they say, like, that's exactly what I would do if I were an autocratic ruler in one of the GCC monarchies. It's a good way of organizing things, even because I must say the Americans, compared to some previous powers that dabble in the Gulf, are quite a bit more hands-off in terms of their regulating the domestic politics of a particular country. So they're quite good partners, and particularly they're much better partners than fellow Arabs. And that's why you see all these schemes like the Damascus Declaration and so on and so forth, that they always stay on paper. Whereas the Americans, even when you intervene in Bahrain, you do incredible things like even in terms of repression, it's fairly awkward because you are taking on medical doctors and so on and so forth. I mean, there will be some huffing and puffing at the State Departments, but then things go back to the way they are, and this is exactly what happened. So this makes perfect sense. And this is why you have this situation that sort of details the intimate security relationship between the United States and the GCC countries. This is something which was built on a sort of infrastructure of steel and concrete that was started being put in place by the British up until the late 60s, and that has significantly expanded since then. And quite interesting, in the last few years has even expanded so below the political radar, because in the name of force protection, and for good reason, even as a local commander, you do have the authority to sort of expand the footprint. So this is quite interesting, because there's always been this tension between, trying to reduce the footprint as much as possible in the Gulf because of the tension between the domestic political legitimacy of the rulers and the American presence, and then the need to actually augment this footprint when for reasons of force protection. So yeah. I mean, they can make decisions in maybe not local commanders in the sense of the authority, but CENTCOM, for example, can make decisions that are then perceived by the local population as an expansion of the footprint. No, I mean, certainly without consulting. I mean, they would consult with the local political power, but quite interesting, a lot goes on without even getting on the American political radar. That's what I'm saying. I mean, it's like, because of course, I mean, and quite understandably, if you are a politician and you have someone, an officer who comes and says, I mean, we are doing this because we need it for force protection, you cannot really sort of oppose that, I mean, like, for good reason. So even that is not a very critical remark, but that's just what is going on. So in a nutshell, let me give you a little like, brief baby milk formula for, and this is before we start talking about Iraq. The rise of a new security architecture in the Gulf is very unlikely because the GCC states will not talk to Iran seriously, and serious is the operative word, about a new multilateral deal without America being at the table. Whereas Iran, if you look at all the plans that they put up over the years, there was one a few months ago, but I collected all of them, so I have like 7 or 8 that have been put up in the last 10, 15 years. One of the conditions they always ask for in a new multilateral deal is the withdrawal of foreign forces. So you don't escape from that. I sometimes joke with my Canadian colleagues who are very keen on track 2 that the Gulf is the opposite of track 2 diplomacy because everybody is talking all the time and nobody is saying anything. But I mean, and this is basically where we have been at for a very long time. So if you want, something may come out of the P5+1 Iran dialogue. The Gulf countries themselves look at the whole issue as a global problem quite correctly. But good luck with that. Look what has been happening recently. It doesn't seem to be very auspicious. So where does Iraq stand in all of this when we look at sort of Gulf security more broadly? I mean, the answer is, of course, I don't know, and I will wait to hear from you who are Iraq experts. But if you project, let's say 5 years from now, we can look at basically 2 options. We could have a Gulf-leaning Iraq that collaborates closely with the Arab monarchies of the GCC. And what you do have as a result is a cooperation on oil output, on prices. You have sort of a unity in the Arab League, which has been somewhat revived recently in order to deal with the Syrian crisis, to address the Syrian issue alongside the UN. So from a diplomatic point of view, that would be quite a coup for these Gulf Arab monarchies. You would have something that is still going on, which is a balanced resolution of the border and war reparations issues. So that's something that, quite a few issues still under Chapter 7, fairly significant problems. We've had like the visit of the Kuwaiti foreign minister recently to Iraq, trying to solve that, but quite a lot under that file still. Then, of course, cooperation on counterterrorism, and maybe in the long run, you could have a very gradual healing of sectarian tensions on this side of the Gulf. And of course, from an American point of view, you would have the benefit of seeing a curbing of Iranian influence in the region. Alternatively, if we are looking at an Iraq that leans more in the direction of Iran in its Gulf and Middle East policy, these are the outcomes. You would have an Arab League that is more divided. You would have the issues from the first Gulf War remaining unresolved, and do not underestimate the capacity of lawyers to drag things along. I mean, even it can go on for a very long time if people become obstinate. Quite clearly, a lack of intelligence and security coordination. And Iran, to make a long story short, will remain the fulcrum of the arc of resistance that it has tried to embody for quite a few years now. And then sectarianism will remain and persist as a defining factor, as it is indeed now in the international relations of the region. So that's all I had to say, and I will just leave on the video this. I found it when I was in the Gulf last time, and I think it's a quite telling, says quite a bit, let's say, about the sort of popular culture and Gulf perceptions of Iran and United States dealing with Gulf politics. And you see that, it's quite self-explanatory with two sharks bickering while... I know, they're sharks, so look at their teeth. And at the same time, sort of shaking hands, like under the water. And also look on the right, it's Al-Khalij Al-Arabi. Thank you very much indeed.
Ambassador Dunbar.
No, there's no place to put this anyway. No, I want to have it. I want to drink it, not you. Well, thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and grateful to Richard Norton for inviting me. I do not have a PowerPoint for the simple reason that I put a good deal of thought into this presentation. It may not seem that way, but so made some notes coming down on the train from Maine at a very early hour this morning. So here I am, and I'm very pleased to be doing it. When Richard asked me to do this, I said, oh, well, I'd like to talk more about Yemen, which is a country I'm supposed to know something about. And as I thought about it, this came out to be a rather different talk. I am going to try to stick to the 15 minutes so that you have enough time to make points to us and we back to you when we're through. What I thought I'd do would be, first of all, to talk about the sort of back to the future reality that the United States finds itself dealing with when it is looking out at the Gulf and what we need to do there. A man known to a number of us here, Ambassador Chaz Freeman, set a record. I think it was somewhat exaggerated in the length of time it took him to master the Arabic language before he went to be ambassador in Saudi Arabia at the time of Desert Shield and Desert Storm. And when he got all through with it, somebody asked him, "How is your Arabic?" And he said, "Well, I'm pretty good at stability in the region, but very poor at ordering a cup of coffee." And he managed that extremely well. And I think we are again back in a situation where we are dealing with the defense of a vital United States and world interest in maintaining a secure access to the hydrocarbons of the Arabian Peninsula at reasonable prices. That is something I can get my mind around because it's what I did for the 32 years that I served in the department. And I think this is really a major concern that we face now. There is a lot of talk. I teach a course on the political economy of the Middle East, and we've been learning all about the shale gale and the fact that miraculously the United States is at last going to be freed of its dependence on Middle East oil. If the shale gale isn't enough, then the alternative energies are going to make it so that, as the futurist Amory Lovins contends, we will stop using oil not for want of supply, but for want of demand. Those are two interesting points. I think for a while the shale gale is going to have an impact on where we buy our oil. It apparently isn't going to go on for all that long, and it is going to be a few years before alternative energy really begins seriously to displace oil and natural gas, leaving out other hydrocarbons as the primary source of energy for the United States and the world. In the meantime, we face that same interest of being sure that we are able to deal with the states of the GCC in being sure that we have access to, we in the world have access to their resources. That is something that I can get my mind around. And as a traditional diplomat, I was somewhat daunted when I saw what the duties of diplomats assigned to the embassy in Baghdad during the height of the American presence there were, and wondered how I could possibly be a diplomat. And I guess the answer would be to go back to school and retool and come back a transformational diplomat, which fortunately I never had to do. I can get my mind around what we need to be doing, and it is to be dealing with the states of the Gulf, first of all, to understand them and to maintain a clear-eyed assessment of kind of how the regimes are doing and what is likely to be the future of those states, and then to act on that assessment. That is traditional diplomatic stuff. We have been good at it in varying degrees for since the onset of the Cold War a long time ago, and we will need to be good at it again. So I just make that first very simple point about the Gulf states. Now, having said that, there are going to be we are going to have a lot of problems to deal with. First of all, it is a new Gulf. There have been the stirrings of an Arab awakening in the Gulf. And I think the first issue that we have to be monitoring and to understand how we approach both particular states and all the states of the GCC is whether this awakening is the start of something big, or if the traditional view that the Gulf states are going to be able to solve this with a combination of financial inducements and promises of gradual reform, or if the lid is going to come off, the lid of the pressure cooker, to use a cooking instrument that has become prominent in the last couple of days, but that we will have to be doing something different about it. That was something we weren't worrying about when I was dealing with the Gulf. It was assumed that the Gulf states would be able to hang on against their internal opposition. And we're going to need to be serious about that and to be adroit in our diplomacy when it appears that a state is going to collapse and that something new is going to happen, and be ready to deal with it. I think in dealing with the parts of the Arab awakening where people have truly woken up, we were quite agile in doing that. I would cite particularly Egypt, when the administration turned very quickly when it realized that Hosni Mubarak and his regime were not going to survive in their present form. And as many of us here know, Ambassador Frank Wisner, who had been sent to console Mubarak and to be sure that we were behind him, was thrown under the bus by the change in American policy. So that's going to be a difference. We're going to need to have the whatever the Arab awakening is likely to be in mind, and that's going to be hard to understand. But again, I think it is something that we know how to do. The second problem is that we are going to be dealing with 13 years of, again, of an entirely different kind of diplomacy, a very hard-edged diplomacy, in which we sought the transformation of two political orders in Iraq and Afghanistan. Historians have yet to judge what is going to come out of that, but I just want to say that my sense is that we took on, certainly in the case of Iraq, in the case of both of them, far more than we could chew. In Iraq, we didn't have to. In Afghanistan, we were likely to be there, and who knows what would have happened if we had not had the second preoccupation of Iraq in the middle of the last decade. As a result, we have failed. I'm very grateful to Professor Legrenzi for telling me that the point that if you have great military power, the thing to do is never to use it, but to have it behind your diplomacy. We have used it twice in the last decade, and I think our position, in the short term at least, is weakened as a result of having done so. Furthermore, I think there was a lesson to be drawn from what we did in Vietnam 30 years ago, and we did not draw that lesson as strongly as we should have, in my opinion. People speak of the invention of coin, and I will just use a shorthand term for this. Many of you will remember who General Maxwell Taylor was at the time in the 1960s, when we were going to save Southeast Asia from communism, and we were going to do it via the vehicle of what was then called counterinsurgency. At least we made a nice sounding acronym for it the second time. It was the same thing, and we should have known better. These are going to be contentious relationships, I think, with some of the Gulf states. Our interests are not the same as particularly the activist states, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, in other parts of the world, notably Syria, and the GCC in general, with respect to Iran across the Gulf. And I think that those states would like to see Iran greatly weakened and would like to see the regime there overthrown. I think we would too. But I think that the perspective of the Gulf states is unrealistic in seeking those overthrows, at least in the short run, and that we will find ourselves in a difficult position with them as we seek, and I think this is a very important U.S. national interest, almost vital, as we seek to avoid a war in Iran, in any case, and in particular, a war in Iran in which we are involved. I think some of the Gulf states would find that to be a less than troubling outcome, and we will differ sharply on that point. So it's going to be contentious. It's going to require agility on our part, but I frankly think that we are able to deal with it. Now, and finally, those are substantive problems that we are going to face in our dealings with the Gulf states. We also have bureaucratic problems within the U.S. government and in general, and in particular in the State Department, that we are going to need to overcome. And I confess, I never thought I'd be standing somewhere and saying that I have a parochial interest in the success of the State Department, but I guess we do. I do. The State Department is in difficulties just in terms of its clout within the U.S. government. A couple of statistics that a friend of mine who is generally reliable cited, and so I'm going to cite them here. There are 8,000 American diplomats. I forget how much bigger the bands in the Defense Department are than that number of people, according to Secretary Gates, who I think probably had it right. The thing that is really troubling to me is that 1,500 of those people do diplomacy, and the other 6,500 are the administrative tail that wags the poor little State Department chihuahua. And that is troubling. Another point, in the last couple of decades, the number of senior jobs in the State Department that go to Foreign Service officers is said to have declined from 65 to 70%, between 65 and 70%, to around 20%. Another one, and this gets into good, nice, clean bureaucratic infighting, is that the national security staff has grown from 50 people, a small, tight, really elite organization under Henry Kissinger, State Department people lined up and knifed one another in the back to get those jobs. I think perhaps Ambassador Loftus will concur that those were the jobs you really want. It is now 300 people, and it is a matter of routine for national security staffers to conduct American diplomatic business overseas. Perhaps Ambassador Loftus will comment on that point, set me straight if I need to be set straight, and or whatever else he chooses to say. Secondly, a friend, and this was a number of decades ago, commented once that the State Department position in doctrine in interagency negotiation was one of preemptive capitulation, that we were not prepared to get down and fight clean or dirty with our bureaucratic adversaries. It's now even worse than that, because the substantive part of the State Department has capitulated, maybe not preemptively, but they have lost, in any case, to the administrative component in general and to the Bureau of Diplomatic Security. I say, no, I won't say that. I was going to use an Arabic epithet translated into English, but I think I will stay away from that one. As a result, I cannot conceive of how I would do this job that has been described to me. My work was to get out and know people, understand what was going on, and write assessments about whether Algeria, or whether I shouldn't have been doing it as ambassador to Yemen, a member of my staff should have been, but I couldn't help myself. And so as ambassador to Yemen, as ambassador to a number of other places. That's really hard to do when you're going out and meeting people and you have a Humvee with the engine idling, sitting in front of the coffee shop, and with a nice young man in full battle rattle standing behind a 50 caliber machine gun. I am exaggerating to make a point. And it is said that we're doing, the Congress says we are doing everything we can to protect American diplomats. I think it was said about Oliver Cromwell, Lord protect us from protectors. And because we simply cannot do our job. And I'm delighted to see that prominent career American diplomats, notably Ambassador Ryan Crocker, have been saying, look, we expect we are going to be in harm's way. Even I, in a much less harmful era. Did you put up the 15-minute warning yet? You probably did.
I'm getting it.
So I will stop almost immediately.
No.
Said, we expect this. We expect to take risks. We expect to do our job. And that is in conflict with the total safety which marks of American diplomats, which marks a successful tour of duty for a State Department regional security officer. If everybody is locked in the embassy, they're not likely to get killed. and that means bravo. I won't go into this. This is a very difficult dilemma for an ambassador to deal with, but deal with it they will. And so I am optimistic, as I end, that this is going to be, for the next few years, a period of, in which traditional diplomacy comes almost to center stage in our dealings with the Arabian Peninsula. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much to both speakers.
Should we stand up so that we don't have to be?
If you don't get tired, of course, sure, yeah. I think we have had two presentations, one laying out the regional politics and security issues, and the other one, the changing Gulf region, the new challenges, principal American interests in the region, and some of the difficulties in maintaining a diplomatic presence and dealing with these new challenges from within the decision-making and diplomatic circles of the U.S. I think my only request is that we try to limit the comments to the regional and diplomatic issues rather than the domestic issues, because there will be plenty of other opportunities in the program to talk about those issues. So the floor is open to questions.
Will you spot them?
Yes, 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 please.
Well, I don't know if I can ask this question now because it has some domestic implications. Oh, okay. But it seems to me that I was very interested to see your comment at the end about a Gulf-leaning Iraq. But given what Iraq has done vis-a-vis Syria, refused to vote with the Arab League, sort of looking the other way that some Iraqi Shia have gone to fight to protect Bashar al-Assad's regime, its close ties to Iran, its statement of support for the Shia in Bahrain, and kind of actually trying to enhance or stir up sympathy on the part of many Shia, Iraqi Shia, which they already had, to what's going on in Bahrain. It would seem to me that that is not a scenario that seems to play itself out. And I just sort of add another comment there, which I don't know is really relevant here, but I remember, again, interviewing Kurds about Kurdish or KRG declaring independence, and many of them said that one of the main constraints from their perspective would be that if they did that, they would no longer be able to have investments from the Gulf because it wouldn't be politically possible for Gulf states. Also, they would cut off supply links to the Gulf and then become totally dependent on Turkey because they wouldn't be able to import industrial goods, which is critical. Barham Saleh, for example, is very key on that. So that would seem to go in the other direction, because certainly Kurds wouldn't be happy if we had increasing, but with Maliki's increasing sectarian policies, how does that kind of then affect your scenario for the future?
Okay, thanks a lot. I think your examples are perfect in the sense that they illustrate this push and pull in terms of Iraqi foreign policy. On the one hand, there is always this sort of gravitational pull towards Iran, which is there for obvious reasons in terms of affinity from an ethnic point of view, from a religious point of view, and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, though, there is always a sort of a belonging to the wider sort of Arab system. And the examples that you make are quite telling. The only thing I would say, though, is that it's for other Arabs as well to keep the door open to Iraq in terms of letting Iraq develop its foreign policy and making a reasonable accommodation. Because on the one hand, you cannot expect particularly some Shia politicians to close their door towards Iran. Because if you look at Iraqi history, there have been many instances in which, it was good for them for that door to be open because you had to quickly pack up and leave. So that is unthinkable as a request. But on the other hand, there are many things that also particularly GCC countries can do to make Iraq feel more at ease in trying to develop a coordinated policy at the Arab League level. But ultimately, you're absolutely right. You made two examples that illustrate the two poles of this dichotomy, and we'll have to see and what happens in 5 years from now. There is always a trade-off for Iraq, and a choice will need to be made.
Nobody mentioned the Obama pivot to Asia.
Yep.
Now, okay, the Gulf is part of Asia, but generally speaking, the pivot seems to be towards the Far East. So I think it'd be important just to have a sense of that. I've read recently Greg Gordon's work from Vermont, who thinks that the relationship with the Gulf will change. It will become more transactional, a little bit colder and more objective and based upon shared interest and especially in counter-terrorism. And we'll move away from being so focused upon the oil game. Faraz Jerjes from LSE says it's business as usual, that the relationships are established and they will be enduring. Anushat Ashami says that there will actually, that American interests will strengthen, that oddly the pivot to Asia and China's increasing reliance upon Gulf oil, with 1 million barrels a day currently going from Saudi Arabia to China, will actually see American interests increase in the Gulf. So I'd quite like to have a sense of where you think the Gulf fits in with the Obama pivot and whether these interests will wane or increase. But then just tying to oil, it is about supply and demand, I totally agree. With the literature saying that America could be an energy exporter in 30 years' time, and totally losing that desire to have any sort of oil, and Saudi Arabia being an importer, indeed. I mean, the guy from Chatham House, Paul Stevens, talks about Saudi Arabia being an importer of energy. So energy is going to have a serious effect upon interests and posture and doctrine going forward.
I'd like to throw that question to Ambassador Dunbar.
Okay, well, there are not. Is this on? I can't tell. Or it is. Thank you. Yes. Let me start with energy because that is the one that ended your interesting series of points. I think when we say, first of all, this feeling that Saudi Arabia being an importer of energy, okay, that is for the distant future, I should think. The reason that we have the shale gale is the simple maxim that proven reserves, let's just keep it simple, proven reserves of oil and gas depend upon existing prices and existing levels of technology. And you've seen a wonderful example of that in learning how to exploit the shale oil. I think what I would say is that we cannot be sure of any of this. It does appear that there is going to be a sharp increase in the world's demand for energy, particularly India and China and other countries as they become stronger. But this is going to take some time, and in that time there may be development of renewables that will have an effect of driving down the price of oil. I don't think so. That's never happened in the long run. But I just, as usual, question very much any generalizations that are going to be made about the future of energy. I think that the president, when he speaks of all of the above, is absolutely right. And I hope that we get as serious. Maybe we won't be able to get as serious as the Germans, but if we could get to be a little bit more serious than we now are about renewables, we'll be in a very good position. That for energy, maybe not enough, and we can continue, but the pivot to Asia, we've pivoted. What's your question? Could you just rephrase it?
Well, I think there's often a geographic misunderstanding what the pivot to Asia means, with it being often assumed that pivot means a total pivot away from the Middle East, sort of forgetting the fact that the Middle East is actually in Asia. But curious to know whether what sort of posture and relationship do you think the pivot means in the Gulf going forward for the US and these Gulf states? Do we see it changed, or do we see it as business as usual?
I guess it depends on what you mean by business as usual. I think we see a perhaps smaller relationship with, sure, there's going to be an interest in countering terrorism, but I think we will certainly be focusing on that traditional interest and hoping, as everybody does, even perhaps the Saudis, that it is an interest in which oil plays a smaller role in the world, and that to the extent that we can, we concentrate on the power that is going to be the most important for us. One thing that is deeply disheartening to me is to have heard several China experts here, one at BU and one, I think, from BC at a talk I went to, saying that this is going to be a confrontational relationship. And I think that is something that we should avoid at all prices. And I would just argue, and again, I'm wishy-washy about energy. I'm being definite here. But with respect to China, do the math and see what that relationship is like, that power relationship is likely to be 20 years from now. Now, there was stuff in the middle you said about the...
With your permission, we'll move to the next. We'll take two more questions, and please try to be brief about your questions.
Thank you. My question is for Professor Legrenzi. I wanted to ask if you thought sectarianism played a role in the foreign relations of all Gulf states, and if not, what accounts for the variation? So I'm interested particularly in why the UAE has seemed to pursue quite a strong, healthy economic relationship with Iraq, whereas countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia have pursued maybe a more pro-Sunni policy. So what accounts for that variation?
I think this is related to the protagonism of the single countries on the world stage. I don't think there is, perhaps with the exception of Saudi, a particular inclination to play sort of a sectarian card for the sake of playing the sectarian card. I think it's a sort of self-conscious policy. So when Qatar and Saudi Arabia, to different extent and with sometimes different aims, want to project their powers onto various sort of regional situations, they do that utilizing and exploiting the sectarian card. So then this, of course, is very different from the realm of commercial relations that follow a somewhat different logic.
May I just make 2 sentences, not even? Oh, okay.
No, please.
2 sentences. It is interesting to me, having been ambassador to Qatar and having known Sheikh Hamad when he was Minister of Defense, and having seen what he's become. Qatar, Sheikh Hamad's policy was based on twisting the tiger's tail when he first came to power, and I find it interesting and saddening that he is lining up seems to be lining up with the Saudis in terms of supporting sectarian groups, notably in Syria.
Thank you. And one last question. Yes, please.
Oh, you made me. I got my slap. Thank you.
So the Saudi-Iraqi sort of disengagement predated the Syrian conflict. I mean, Iraq sort of tried to reach out to Saudi Arabia in 2007 by appointing its ambassador, but the Saudis did not return that favor till March 2012 by appointing non-residential ambassador, the Saudi ambassador to Jordan. So how do you sort of explain this disengagement from the Iraqi side or the Saudi side? Which one plays more role in sort of this cold relation?
I mean, I think this is a good question. I mean, you start from a situation of lack of trust, and then a few steps, as you correctly highlighted, had been made to start to rebuild that trust that was sorely lacking. And then, though, with the onset of the sort of like Arab Spring, if you will, for lack of a better term, but in particular with the sort of slide into a civil conflict of Syria, those sort of timid steps have been then countermanded, and you went back to a situation of a almost of a lack of trust, of almost absolute lack of trust. So it's very difficult sort of to point the finger to sort of who has done more, who has done less, but I think you should start from the sort of historical situation of a sort of perduring lack of trust, these few steps that had been made, and then the situation again deteriorating because of the regional events.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Professor Legrenzi and Ambassador Dunbar.